isn't funded by New Zealand On Air. We stream live from the MediaWorks Auckland studio, 7:30pm Mondays on Facebook, YouTube, and the Daily Blog. The podcast is available afterwards on Apple Podcast, Rova, Spotify, and YouTube. Joining me tonight for our Economics 2022 first show special is the greatest political panel in New Zealand broadcasting. He is legally Stuff's most right-wing commentator allowed by law. It's called the Lindsay Perigo Act. He's the Cthulhu of capitalism, the libertarian liquidator, Mr. All Taxes Theft, the one, the only, Damien Grant. Kia ora, Damien. Welcome to 2022. How were your holidays in 15 words or less?
It was great. We went down to some marginalised area to look at the poor.
You should have stuck to the 15 words or less. He's a dad. He was once a Crown prosecutor, author, yak whisperer, finance spokesperson for the loyal opposition. He's the only reason you would ever vote National, and a man with 73% more charm than the entire shadow cabinet put together. But that's not very hard. The scrapper from Tauranga, the Right Honourable Simon Bridges. Kia ora, comrade.
Kia ora, Happy New Year, peace be with you.
Thank you. Before we go on, we have to do check-in. Simon, how is your wee boy after his accident last year? All good?
Look, he's actually fantastic. He had another doctor's appointment and everything is great. He's got to just act a little bit like an old man for another week or two, but he is he's back to his usual naughty self, and we're very happy with that.
Amen, ka pai. And last but not least, he is one of New Zealand's greatest public economists and a must-read weekly commentator. If Harry Potter was also a Jedi, he'd be Bernard Hickey. Kia ora, Bernard. Any New Year's resolutions?
I need to work on my introduction style. I can see that I need to ramp it up about 10 levels.
There you go. You'll make it here. Don't you worry. Tonight, for our first episode, ladies and gentlemen, we are doing a 1-hour special on the economy. How has COVID warped capitalism, and will the climate crisis cripple free markets? While domestically we ask, how much do we all love Adrien Orr? When will inflation become political? And should Grant Robertson get a knighthood for services to property speculators? Plus, we will have a final word at the end of the show where each panelist gets a 90-second rant on any topic they want. Can we breach broadcasting standards this week? Let's kick things off with the rude state of capitalism. Damien Grant. Central banks around the world staved off global financial collapse in 2008 because of the corrupt and venal actions of financial gods who economically destabilized the entire planet for their naked greed via a rigged Ponzi scheme of credit default swaps. We printed trillions. It's inflated stocks and property prices globally while artificially creating the lowest interest rates in 5,000 years. That sound you hear is Adam Smith turning in his grave at the horror Milton Friedman and his acolytes have mutilated his capitalism into. When does the bubble go pop?
I don't know, but I have been hanging out so long. I have been predicting a breakout of inflation for 10 years.
And finally it's here.
10. I've been waiting. I checked. My first column predicting inflation was a decade ago, almost to the day. It was like unbelievable. So I'm extremely disappointed. I remember I was having coffee with Dr. Brash to name drop, and I was saying, what's happening, Don? Why are we not seeing inflation? And Dr. Brash said, I don't know, but it's very disappointing when the real world will not match our theories.
Damien, FUQ, follow-up question. The first responsibility of government in a democratic society is to protect and safeguard the lives of its citizens. Our incredibly low mortality numbers and hospitalizations, alongside our remarkable 90% plus double vaccination rates, are a public health triumph. Like the Goblin King Jared at the end of the movie Labyrinth, your death cult libertarian capitalism has no power over us. Voters want a big state to protect them now, don't they?
Yeah, of course they do. We're all in love with Adrien Orr and Grant Robertson. That is because we no longer live as free men. We have subjected, we have debased ourselves. We have taken our soul and our spirit. Hank Reardon died so long ago. We are now small, insignificant, kept men. It is a shame and it is a tragedy, but you are right. I mean, in the face of a fairly mild pandemic that would have carted off maybe 7,000 of us,
which would
have been a tragedy. I'm not mitigating that, but we have traded the perception of security and safety, and for that we have given everything away. It's a disaster. On the other hand, we have seen one of the greatest transfers of wealth from the poor and the renters and the debtors towards people like me and Bernard and Simon Bridges who own property.
Simon,
so fantastic.
Simon Bridges, in 2020, you, sir, and Paul Goldsmith were loudly telling voters you would have, and I quote, a bonfire of red tape legislation, which seemed like the most bizarre position to take. It was like people sprinting towards the state for protection from COVID, while you and Paul are handing out pamphlets telling people, see that state you were running towards? If we get in, we'll knock it all down. Right-wing government with a small g mantra is not the message voters want from their government in the middle of a once-in-a-century pandemic. They want a bloody big state. Will National just rehash dead, cold, little government rhetoric, or will it seek something bigger from capitalism in 2022?
Oh, look, I think it's true that all New Zealanders, including myself, and we talked about Harry before, want great public services. We want a strong police force. We want all these things. So we don't want to sort of go to a Damien Grant style kind of, it's just defence and possibly a few police, and other than that you're left to your own devices. I don't believe that. But I think what you can do is have too much of a good thing. We, on the latest numbers from Grant Robertson and Treasury, are going to see a 68% increase in spending, $128 billion, $6 billion more in new spending than we've seen before. I'm sorry, I'm being distracted because I'm outside a restaurant called Bella Cucina in Queenstown, and something just caught on fire, and the waitress has just come out and stamped all over it. That's very, I'm sorry, it is very distracting. But back to my
Sure,
main point here.
Sure.
You can have too much of a good thing. This increase in spending is going to not by itself, but contribute to inflation and hurt a lot of New Zealanders.
Simon, FUQ, follow-up question. When you were last on the show, I asked if Muldoon's Fortress New Zealand and Think Big nationalistic economics was just ahead of its time. Surely, on a planet where global external shockwaves are fast becoming the new normal, our free market globalist mindset must be challenged. Why isn't National doing that?
No, look, I think, as I say, you want good public services, you want spending from government, but also, look, actually there's a line at which it's over the top, and which it causes things, or is contributing to adding fuel to the fire to things like inflation. So I think there's a happy medium. There's a place we should be at. I'm not hugely critical of where we've been. We could criticise for a long time Adrien Orr and what he's done in terms of money.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that.
And we could criticise Grant Robertson for, again, a lot of spending over the last 2-3 years. I don't want to look backwards. My point simply is looking forwards. Actually, with where we're at, an overheating economy, where there's constrained resources, it's hard to get staff, supply is difficult. That's not a situation to heap and to pile a heap more public money that's just competing with private resources.
Bernard, America is running trillion-dollar deficits, and China's economy is seeing a huge slowdown, while extreme weather events are drastically impacting crop yields and pushing more people into hunger, yet billionaires are self-funding space flights. Isn't the story of capitalism in 2022 going to be more obscene inequality?
Absolutely. I'm a bit surprised that Damien's so disappointed with the actions of the government, which have made wealthy people much wealthier and has guaranteed their returns forevermore. And in fact, it's been doing so for the last 15 years. And on the face of it, it's worked. We've got a 3.4% unemployment rate here, and in the United States, it's 3.9%. But you're right, Oma, that this is unsustainable because effectively, over the last 15 years, we've seen central banks and governments act in the interests of asset owners to make them richer as a way to rescue the economy, and effectively piled up assets ever higher in the hands of fewer and fewer. And surprisingly, they're not spending the money, they're piling it up into big piles or buying pieces of art or NFTs or whatever it is, in the hope that eventually, when confidence is lost in some of these currencies, that they still have something left over. And ultimately, too, the voters at large are looking at the situation going, that's actually not fair. And it's also not going to work in the long run. So we're in this sort of interregnum, a period between the great original sin and the eventual reckoning, where politically, the people who've missed out during the last 15 years of money printing going to rich people will go, actually, no, we won't allow that anymore. Now, it may take a while, but we'll get there in the end.
Bernard, follow-up question. In the 1980s, the time between weather events causing $1 billion worth of damage was 3 months. It's now 18 days. There is a point, is there not, in the climate crisis where rebuilding in time for the next event is unmanageable? Isn't this ultimately capitalism's challenge in 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025? Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Sounds like a bomberism to me.
It is true that there are weather events causing more damage, but that's partly because economies are larger and so are populations. But the general point is that as the climate gets warmer, there's going to be more extreme weather events and more damage. It's actually not a problem for capitalism if capitalism was properly assessing its liabilities. And in fact, some of the insurance companies are quite good at this, and some of the regulators and central banks are starting to get onto this. But in the end, capitalists don't need to worry because, in effect, they have guaranteed returns from governments and central banks that they are able to control.
Hold on.
And as long as that's the case, we're fine.
Bernard,
they're fine.
That is not your. I'm going to pull you up there. You said capitalists don't need to worry. I'd like to point out the difference between capitalists and owners of capital. Because a true capitalist would have absolutely nothing to do with this state put backing up asset prices. It is a corrupt owners of capital who are benefiting from this crony intervention. True capitalists like myself are appalled at what's going on.
So the true capitalists are quite happy to call for central banks to be put in the thrall of the politicians again. So get rid of the central bank independence.
If you call for the central banks to be under the control of the state, you are by definition not a capitalist. You are an owner of capital who was seeking to benefit and enrich themselves from the corrupt practice of central bankers, and that is exactly what has been happening from the Green Stamp put onwards.
Final word, is capitalism still winning in 2022, or was Marx right? Simon?
Marx certainly wasn't right. I go along actually a lot with what Bernard was saying in his first contribution there. I think what I would add, though, is if you look at, dare I say it, the average New Zealander or many New Zealanders, whilst it's true that you could say, well, at one level, we're in this interregnum, things are kind of good, unemployment is low, most people who want a job, not everyone, but most people who want one have a job. The lived experience, and certainly the business and the consumer sentiment surveys are showing something slightly different, and that's a picture of much more precariousness, much more pessimism about 2022. So I think, whilst it's perhaps a bit trite, it's going to be, I think, a heck of a ride this year as we kind of see where it all goes. You will have seen my columns, but I'll just say these two things. I think they're powerful numbers. 4.9% inflation we ended last year with, 2.4% wage growth. That's not, if it goes on, a pretty picture for New Zealand.
Bernard, is capitalism still winning in 2022, or was Marx right?
Marx was wrong for a bunch of reasons, but capitalism is currently winning. And ultimately, though, capitalism will lose because it will eat itself unless it accepts some regulation and some direction to share some of the proceeds
Wise
of
words.
all this capitalism.
Wise
and
words.
we'll see that eventually. Let's hope it doesn't happen, isn't forced by some sort of major geopolitical
doing what I can on that front, Bernard. I really am. Damien, is capitalism winning in 2022, or was Marx right?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Bernard says capitalism will need some regulations. And of course, if we go back to the original GFC, one of the theories, it's not universally accepted, I acknowledge, but one of the original causes of the GFC was the attempt by the Clinton administration to give home ownership towards low-income families, which related in the whole no-doc loans, which resulted in the whole CDC.
Oh, this was the left-wing's fault.
So, and if you have a look at a lot of the issues that are happening now, you have a look at asset price inflation. Asset price inflation at the moment is driven by two things. One, the building code and land use regulation that makes building a cheap house in New Zealand effectively illegal. And you've got the massive increase in asset prices as a result of the inflationary policies and the low interest rates of the central bank. I would say, in opposition to what Bernard's position about capitalism, is a lot of the things that are driving inequality today are the perverse effects of the regulation that Bernard is calling for. And so what Bernard is saying, what my interpretation of what Bernard is saying, is that we are seeing the perverse outcomes of regulation. And so Bernard wants to see more of those perverse outcomes to rectify the problems that he's seen before.
I doubt that's what he means. I'm going to stave in the dark.
I agree with a lot of what Damien is saying around regulation stopping the building of house prices. But I add one point in there. I think the regulation is being used by councils and government over the long term to not invest in infrastructure because it is accidentally on purpose engaged in a multi-decade transfer of wealth from the future and from renters now into the hands of asset owners, and investing in infrastructure which would allow the building of those houses is actually against that whole aim of shifting wealth to today's older asset owners. And so Damien's right that the regulations are stopping us from building houses. I'm saying actually get rid of the regulations, but at the same time invest enormous amounts of public assets and attention, and use the public's balance sheet to solve these issues of not enough housing, and use a supply shock to deliver some sanity to asset prices.
So I suppose the point is, though, if only that was what the money that government was spending was being spent on. And it just doesn't seem to me that's what's going on. The second point I just make, we're talking about regulations and whether they work or not. We've got a great, or a terrible rather, example at the moment, and I acknowledge National voted for it. We didn't expect it to do anything like what it seems to be, and that's the triple CFA, which fundamentally means that rather than going after pawnbrokers and people in trucks selling to people who can't afford anything, there's people who want to buy houses who probably can, but maybe one of them is buying a latte too many, and so on, just tying the lending regimes up in far too much red tape. And so I do say bomb to that, a bonfire on some of those sort of things. Well, look, it's certainly what the banks are saying, and I'm not naive. I don't sit here and say, well, if they're saying it has to be the case, but it does seem to be that picture's building up. And I suppose the point, Bernard, would be, actually, dare I say it, David Seamer's kind of got a point. Maybe it's something we should have an inquiry about.
Oh, not an inquiry.
Yeah, I think the triple CFA problems are as much the banks using them as an excuse to do something they wanted to do anyway, which is to reduce some of their risks in the housing market, and B, to deal with the tightening of lending requirements from the Reserve Bank. And there's nothing better that you can tell a mortgage broker or a customer when they come into the office and you say no, which
It's
is
the regulation,
nothing to do with
right.
me, it's the government's fault. And so I think we should wait before we judge this as a triple CFA problem until we see how the banks shake out. Because I think they are using it as a short-term excuse to justify a tightening of credit, which was possibly needed and certainly forced by the Reserve Bank.
We have to move on, comrades, to issue 2. China. Simon, John Key's sale of 49% hydropower assets to create a $400 million irrigation slush fund for dairy intensification put all our cows in one Beijing paddock. How grateful should New Zealand be that National compromised our economic geopolitical security by being so dependent on China? 1 to 10, 10 being the highest. 10, yay, we're chained to China. 1, wasn't such a good idea. Which one?
There's a huge amount to unpack and everything you just said. I really, 1 or 2 beers in, not exactly sure where to go with that. But let me just say this. I think the world's changed. I said this a few times. If you'd caught me a decade ago, I would have very nicely said, that China and trade with China, everything that goes on in terms of China from a New Zealand perspective is an unequivocal good. And, there's no doubt in trade terms it's been a phenomenal ride and story, and that's what Fonterra and Vesper and others will tell you. But I certainly have changed my position because as the facts change, look, that's what happens. And we live in a more dangerous, uncertain world. China has been much more aggressive. And I, for one, am on the side of, I hate to use the modern vernacular, but I'm going to because what comes to mind, calling that out and being more forthright about China than we have in the past under Helen Clark or John Key, because I think we're in a different, much more uncertain time. And it requires us to stand up for our values and rights.
But hasn't Mahuta been doing that? Because I've been watching what the foreign minister has been doing, and she does seem to be taking a reasonably robust approach against China.
It confuses me, and I hope that doesn't mean that it's just because I'm confused. I think it's been inconsistent, Damien. I think you have seen times when, for clearly, it seems to me, the right reasons, our partners have made forthright statements, and we've wanted to distance ourselves from those. Some would say that's independent foreign policy. Maybe there's something in that, but I'm just simply saying as a value proposition. Actually, look, I think we are in uncertain, difficult times. We probably should be even more forthright is a position I'm increasingly coming to.
Well, let's look at that in the follow-up question. At what point do you think that we have to publicly side with our political masters in America against our economic overlords in China? When does that happen?
No, I don't accept the masters term. I don't accept we want to be like Australia, which is, what is it, deputy sheriff or whatever it is in Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific, as they now call it. But I do think when we see wrong, we have to call out, and that goes for America, of course, as well. I mean, anyone I think who's reading anything internationally just sees it's a very difficult world we're in right now, whether it's inflation, whether it's the monetary stuff we've been talking about, actually whether it's Russia and the Ukraine or China and Taiwan. These things worry me, and I think in the end history judges us if we're a bit merely mouthed about some of these fundamental issues.
Damien, China is our largest trading partner ahead of Australia, who is also their largest trading partner. An economic slowdown in China will damage both our largest markets. China is in deep economic strife with Evergrande, Kasia, and now the Shimal Group, all defaulting technically. Industrial profit growth has tumbled, and China's zero tolerance on COVID keeps shutting down ports. Have just-in-time globalized supply chains met their match with COVID?
I think the real question is, can I transfer my insolvency license in New Zealand to China? Because I suspect that there will be some considerable...
There's some money to be made. Is that what I'm hearing? Is that what I'm hearing?
Commission on the Evergrande.
Damon, I think you might have to give up your libertarianism. Working for the Communist Party of China.
So what was the question?
Supply chains, global supply chains, just on time global supply chains. They're over, aren't they?
Yes, I think they are. I was never a huge fan of the whole just in time thing, because it just allowed no flexibility for things that have gone wrong. But then again, I mean, they went right for a very long time. But I just want to come back to this whole issue of China. I think what we are living a little bit in an imperial mindset, that we are part of a larger enterprise. We're not. Five Eyes is not an alliance. It is an intelligence sharing operation. And I'll just pull up what Simon said before. You know, we're out of kilter with some of the Five Eyes people, but you know, Five Eyes is not an alliance. We're not breaching any alliances by doing that. But the flip side of the coin is we wanted to be nuclear free and we wanted to be independent. Well, the flip side of that coin is that we are utterly and totally vulnerable. If China wanted to make an example of somebody, we are the country to make an example of. They could turn off the milk tap and it would cause them some inconvenience and it would devastate us. The reality that we need to get our head in is that we are Finland to China's Soviet Union. And the sooner we get our head around that, the better. We can sit there and take a high moral stand if we like. It's going to change nothing.
If
So
China, well,
you're basically saying we should just do whatever anyone else wants and follow the money.
No, well, yes, in an extent, to an extent, yes. If you were the Prime Minister of Finland in 1950, 1960, are you going to stand up? Because I guarantee you, if things go wrong, the West is not going to come to your aid.
Damien, if China turns aggressive with Hong Kong, let's say over the next couple of months, well, it would be beyond. I mean, right? Anytime a state starts taking art out of a university is a bit of a red flag, isn't it? Things don't get much better after that. If they turn aggressive, with a real show of force, and send in troops into Hong Kong in an act of symbolism to distract from the economic problems they've got, can New Zealand keep trading with China?
Yes, and we can for two reasons.
Yep.
The first reason is that you were saying the primary responsibility of the state is to look after the people who live in it.
Absolutely.
Right? If we terminate our business relationship with China, people in New Zealand are going to suffer a reduction in the quality of life that they cannot currently comprehend. But here's the second thing. We don't trade really with I mean, I've done business with China, right? I've gone to China and you trade with individuals, with small companies, with people inside government-owned enterprises. That's who we're trading with. We are not doing anything to stop what's happening in Hong Kong, to do anything but to the Uyghurs by disengaging with China. Sanctions don't work. Economic disentanglement historically doesn't work. The only thing that does work, as Bill Clinton demonstrated, is when you can drop bombs on Serbia, then great, maybe you'll get a result. But short of that, we need to understand the reality of our place.
Bernard G.
I just want to clarify, I don't think anyone is suggesting, and I'm certainly not, some sort of no trade policy, and that would be naive. We value the trade with China. China's an ancient, very civilized, sophisticated society. I suppose I'm just saying, right is right, and we should stand up for that from time to time.
Bernard G is set to grant himself powers for life at the 20th CCP conference in November. Can we trade with a repressive country accused of mass human rights abuses and still hold the moral high ground at MFAT? Can we?
Yeah, because we trade with America, don't we?
Oh, come on! That is
well done. That's the line of the night. That is the line of the night. Amen, brother.
That, sir,
Amen.
That, sir,
Amen.
Is absolute nonsense.
Speak the truth, Bernard.
You cannot compare
Preach.
the totalitarian genocide practicing Orwellian state
with the military-industrial complex which promotes all of
China,
those particular regimes.
With the slowly deconstructing imperial enterprise that is the United States. I am sorry, Bernard, you're wrong.
Great call.
But it was very funny.
slightly flippant, and doing my very best to increase the ratings.
We appreciate that.
I just want to disassociate myself with everything everyone else has said in this entire section, right? It was all a disgrace, and I had nothing to do with any of the historical or comparisons being made. I still have a political career that could go somewhere.
Oh, so you've had that invitation from Axe. Sorry, Bernard, what were you saying?
Well, Simon is absolutely right, and I can see him right in front of him now, looking at all those little tick boxes down the screen and unticking all of them to connect with us, which is all good. And he's right, of course, that Damien and I are both unelectable, whereas you have been elected. But
don't sound so surprised.
But my broad point, though, is that all around the world there are lots of people that we trade with who do all sorts of things we're not very happy with, including Saudi Arabia. And one of the most interesting little factoids I've seen in the last couple of weeks is that America's longevity, so the amount of time you can expect to live as an American, has fallen by over a year in the last 2 years, whereas China's has risen to the point where now China's expected lifespan is above that of America.
Wow.
But the general point of we now have to see under a Xi-led China, we now have to be more careful, and we certainly need to be aware that if we put all of our eggs into the China basket, we're increasing our risks. And I see New Zealand as a lot like someone who runs into a minefield. They're halfway in it and they haven't been blown up. And then they see the sign that says mines, and they look up and stop and go, right, now I need to back out of this place very carefully. So our aim over the next 20, 30 years should be to diversify as much as we can, as fast as we can, without hopefully the Chinese understanding or knowing or being really pissed off that we're doing it, because it is risky that we now have both Australia and China as our main economic growth drivers, and we need to spread it around a bit. And the other thing is that you haven't mentioned Taiwan in all of this. And this is going to become a very...
There are guards outside the studio right now. If we say anything, we're really not getting out of here alive.
Quite right. I do recognise Taiwan as a legitimate part of the Chinese state, but New Zealand may have to make a choice, and this is one of the things the Australians are beating themselves up over at the moment, because they're actually more exposed than us to China. Although one of the great ironies of the last 2 years is that they've massively increased their iron ore and coal sales to China, despite all of the grief, in theory, that's going on in their trade arrangements. But the Australians, by choosing to really throw their lot in with America and confronting China much more aggressively, has put itself in a position where even Peter Dutton, their Home Affairs Minister and apparent leadership aspirant, reckons that Australia would defend Taiwan if it was attacked by China. And that becomes an interesting one, which, let's hypothetical, Simon, and you're very welcome to let it go through to the keeper. But there's a potential
I certainly
in the next 10, 20
ask
there's
a
a potential
question.
in the next 10, 20 years where you're a member of a tight five in a cabinet that's governing, that has to make a decision about whether we back some action to defend Taiwan or to push back against China in a much more aggressive way. Now, when that moment comes, we need to be sure that we're selling just as much dairy product to the EU or the UK or Peru as we are to China.
I think your eggs in one basket or two baskets point is absolutely entirely agree with that, and that would be true regardless of the politics that we've been talking about, the geopolitics, the real politic of it. I just make a couple of observations. The first one is, if you're talking Aussie, whilst some some of the tough talk we've heard from politicians there has been a bit OTT. And what is also true is, okay, you can talk about rock lobsters or wine or what have you. Fundamentally, their trading relationship hasn't suffered. In fact, the numbers continue to get stronger. That's an interesting point. I think the other thing to say is we would be naive. We talked a lot about this, and Damien's taken a real politic kind of a stance on some of this. But if you look at America right now, I was listening to a podcast of some big tech capitalists a day or two ago. I mean, these guys, they were all guys, are really clear in their head that they are bringing a lot of industry back into the Miamis, the Floridas, the middle of America, and there is a significant decoupling going on. And so I simply make the point that I think in a way you're making, Bernard, which I don't think is us sort of taking sides or having a strong opinion, but it's simply that actually in the end with this going on, there is a sense with which we will have to make our minds up on some of these things at one point, and no one's going to say that any of that is easy.
Bernard, follow-up question. The vast amount of our dairy is sold as milk powder as a base ingredient for the highly manufactured food industry. When that industry can create a synthetic alternative at a cost below organic dairy, the entire industry in New Zealand will implode. Why risk geopolitical trouble with China for a dairy market that is a sunset industry? Put another way, why be reliant on China for the future of DVDs?
Yeah. Firstly, it's going to take a lot longer than everyone expects for that crossover moment from cow-produced dairy protein to plant-produced protein. Secondly, we actually have an opportunity if we can be a lot more friendly to the environment and use a lot less coal to present ourselves as at the top of the food chain for animal produced protein. So it's not just a matter of suddenly everyone stops eating animal produced protein. They're more likely to stop eating the dirtiest animal produced protein and choose and pay more for the most expensive stuff. So there's an opportunity here for New Zealand with this plant, the shift plant, which is to go to high margin. And I think Fonterra have been a bit more successful at that in the last 3 or 4 years than they have been in the past. And secondly, and I think Fonterra and some of the dairy industry is starting to get on top of this. There is an opportunity to convert New Zealand's dairy into having a less painful footprint for the environment, but also to use less coal. And I've got some interesting ideas on how the dairy industry could convert to solar in a very aggressive way to swap over from coal. And
we already do.
And also,
the sun comes down and it's onto the grass.
A little bit more than that, Damien. Bigger. Think bigger. Come on.
But I mean, okay, you want me to think bigger?
No. Yes. Actually, you know what? It was a bad move. Let's step away from thinking bigger.
What about? I mean, solar energy. I mean, goodness gracious, you got clouds. I mean,
as soon as you say solar, sorry, Bernard, he does this. It's like he's just triggered as soon as he says it.
I mean,
but he must like cheap stuff.
What about uranium?
Right? Oh, for the love of Christ! Okay, comrades, we must.
Nice geographical stable area on the central plateau
of Kazakhstan. That's wonderful. Comrades, we must move on to issue 3 in domestic economics. How much do we all love Adrien Orr? When will inflation become political? And should Grant Robertson get a knighthood for services to property speculators? Bernard, last month, Matthew Hooton tweeted a graph showing New Zealand with the highest level of house price inflation with the following message. Quote, why I'm voting Labour. When the Darth Vader of the New Zealand right is cheering your housing policy, something has gone horribly wrong. Should Grant Robertson get a knighthood for services to property speculators?
Well, he'll probably get one anyway, but maybe not for that directly. But the great irony, you're right, is that people voted for Labour and New Zealand First in 2017 being quite nervous that they were going to get for themselves a capital gains tax, or at least a flattening of house prices, which they'd seen had been quite strong under the previous national government. And instead, what they got, and not just after COVID, but before COVID, was an acceleration in house price inflation, which is exactly what they'd seen under Labour between 1999 and 2008. What everyone sort of forgets is that Labour and any party that wants to win the centre needs to keep median voters happy. And median voters are people who live in the suburbs, have 2 double cab utes, own their own home, or at least aspire to own their own home. Te Atu man and woman, I suppose, is one way to describe that median voter.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as they say things like, oh, I'm worried about whether the kids can afford it, what they're actually thinking is, I'll never, ever, ever vote for any party that takes any of that hard-earned, leveraged equity off me. And also, the only way I'm going to get my kids into a house is to ensure that I can leverage up my existing equity even higher and pull equity out and give it as a deposit to my kids. Because at the end of the day, it's all about me and my family protecting ourselves. And I don't trust the politicians of either side to change the system. And by the way, I quite like the system as it is. It's wonderful. And Grant Robertson seems like a nice enough character, and he didn't break this special machine that I have. And all of those people who are renting are losers anyway, and they need to stay as renters because I've now got 2 rental properties and they need to keep paying their rent. So this is the political problem that both parties have.
Yes.
And I don't quite know yet how they're going to solve the problem.
Bernard, the rise of the mega landlord class is a dangerous political influence bordering on plutocracy. You have been a strident critic of neoliberal housing policy. What radical action is required for the generations locked out of home ownership?
Well, actually, I think back to the late 80s and the early 90s as a model for how a group of politicians from both sides of the House and the public at large essentially made a collective community decision, which was to change expectations about inflation and to do some radical things to make that happen, to essentially force through a quite painful policy which shifted everyone's expectations about what were going to happen with prices. So we had price inflation out of control in the 70s and 80s, and the decision made by both Labour and National was to create an independent institution, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, to give it specific targets. In the first case, it was 0 to 2% inflation, and to say to everyone, now this is going to hurt for a bit, but once we've killed this thing, we can be sure that our expectations for inflation are going to be sensible and low out into the long distance. And that's what we did as a society. We broke inflation. Now, we got there with 11.2% unemployment, and it was painful, but we broke inflation. And even now, long-term inflation expectations are still around sort of 2-3%. I think if we as a society are to break this upward spiral, these expectations which homeowners have, that house prices will always double every 10 years. So I'm sure you've been at a few barbecues over the summer, Simon and Damien, where the dreaded issue of property prices has come round. Yeah. And when you ask people what do they think is going to happen with house prices, they say, well, house prices double every 10 years, and that's what they're going to keep doing on average. Now, that, of course, means that if everyone expects that, then they build their lives around that. They build their small business financing. They build their plans for families. They build their ideas of where they're going to live and work. And it may force them to think, right, I'm going to migrate to Australia or the UK. It changes everything. So I think as a society, we need to reset expectations on house price inflation. 0% sounds about right at best. And to give an institution of the government, as we did with the Reserve Bank, the power to change the supply and the demand dynamics so that we get our 0% and that we get house prices back to a level versus incomes that's sensible in the longer run, and in particular get rents down to a level that isn't. That we actually now have the worst, most expensive rents in the world that are 50% overvalued relative to incomes, and we have the highest proportion of people on low incomes who are paying more than 50% of their disposable income in rent in the world.
Amen, comrade. We need to pause now for a brief advert from our sponsor. Damien Grant, tell us about our awesome sponsor, Gravity.
Well, yeah, it was quite hard to get a sponsor for this program, and it's quite difficult to understand why. But we found one, a small company called Gravity Credit Management that operate just across the road from my own practice, and they do debt collection and credit reporting. Most of their clients, so went across and met them, and they told me how it works, but most of their clients are institutions, so they've got a bank, a couple of utilities, telcos, and they're really focused on the reputation of their clients. So they are not the debt collectors who go out there and do the door knock on 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning. They're the sort of organisation that if you've got a outstanding ledger, they will work it, they colour within the lines, and they have a saying that they treat your reputation, the clients, as their own, because ultimately it is.
And what's their number?
0800 Gravity, and if you could support them, you would help support Bomber and I keeping the show on the road.
Simon, with the borders shut, we have less international student exploitation, less migrant worker exploitation, and no hyper-tourism. And we are still aiming at 3.1% unemployment. Pre-COVID, we had 4 million tourists per year, almost our whole population visiting us. No wonder our infrastructure was groaning. Tell me again why Muldoon's Fortress New Zealand isolationism is so bad. Tell me again.
Well, you know, in a sense, if what government is spending money on or investing money on is infrastructure, whether it's transport and roads, and Stephen Joyce had a column on that this weekend. He's no longer an MP, but there's a really good column on some of the things you'd want to do in housing, you're investing in public spending. That might be one thing. I think the problem we've got at the moment, we've got that Fortress New Zealand you talk about, where actually we haven't got immigrants coming in, there's global supply chain issues and so on, and yet what we've also got is a whole lot of money being, in my view, loosely thrown around by both the Reserve Bank, some of that's coming off, and even more of it coming in from Grant Robertson into that overheating economy, and that's causing a lot of problems. Yeah, unemployment is low, but in that sort of environment, it's government competing for workers, competing for materials, for building supplies, you name it, and that's having a very significant inflationary effect. I think on New Zealand, it's not the only thing. I accept it's an international phenomena, but it's certainly adding fuel to the fire in my view. That then leads to that housing issue you've talked about, which is plain and simple, as interest rates go up, that's going to be harder for more of those Te Atatu folk where I come from and that Bernard's talked about. And so I think it's no nirvana we live in at the moment. There's some really problems. I think we all agree with that. I think actually in 2022 we're going to see some of those things around inflation, cost of living, vis-a-vis wage growth, interest rates, start to really hurt a lot of New Zealanders. And I think we'll see that, if I can make this somewhat political as a politician, I think we will see that coming through in the various surveys and polls that we see this year.
Are you saying that National would seek to balance the budget faster than what Grant Robertson is currently aiming at?
I think the basic issue is he's pouring in too much. Now, you get the simplistic view that you got from the CTU economist who used to work from Grant Robertson, probably should have disclosed that in the last two or 3 days, which is that means I'm a National signing up for cuts. No, not at all. We simply are signing up for less, for reining in that new borrowed money from where it's going to be in the next year. As I said earlier, you can have too much of a good thing. Of course, we'd like to see balanced budgets because I think that's a proxy for basically good government. But it's not so much the quantity as the quality of spending. I don't see that, and I think the quality, or the quantity, I should say, is also too high under Grant Robertson.
Well, I mean, you made the comment earlier in the podcast that the Grant Robertson's talking about $128 billion, which you would have got from the HUFU, have you pronounced
That's
it?
right.
And that compares with $75 billion back in 2017 when National left office. And so when Bill English left the Prime Ministership, government spending was 28% of GDP. At $128 billion, it's 35% of GDP. So
where's it projected to go, Damien?
I think it's due to hit 40% based on the.
It's going down over the next 2 or 3 years to 29%.
No. But if you look at the next 2 years, it goes up to 40%. You have a look. It goes up to 40%, and then it trails down. But come on, Bernard, you are not going to tell me that you have any confidence in Treasury's expectations. Frankly, I don't even believe they're the current numbers. But come back to picking on poor old Simon Bridges stuck there in the car in Queensland with a couple of beers in. What are you going to do? Because you made the comment about $128 billion. How do you get that down to a lower percentage of GDP without actually reducing spending?
Well, I make the point again that what's happening in the next year under Grant Robertson is $6 billion in new spending. I mean, I'm really clear it shouldn't be that high. I think in theory you could construct arguments if we had a heap of workers who could build roads and do light rail and do every other, a harbour crossing. That might be one thing. We simply don't. So a $6 billion new spending, operating spending budget is too high, in my view, and will have an inflationary effect at a time when inflation is already running higher than it has in some 30, 40 years.
Damien, you have been a fervent critic of Captain Socialism, aka Reserve Bank Governor Adrien Orr, aka the notorious RBG. You also recently took Treasury to task for their sunny disposition against the gathering clouds of economic doom. Worst case scenario, what's the flock of black swans look like?
Well, the worst case scenario is really ugly, and I think the chances of the worst case scenario happening are low.
But there's a chance.
But they're not zero. And that's what I took about the Treasury's forecasts to task. The Treasury just give a static outcome. This is what the future will look like. And of course, it's nonsense. We can't know what the future would look like. So I think there's a range of possible options. One of them is the sunny predictions, as Bernard was talking about, where they do manage to get government spending down to a lower percentage of GDP 5 years out. But one of the options, one of the black swans, is where interest rates rise, and that triggers a collapse in asset prices and a failure in wider economic confidence. And then you're not looking at 2008, you're looking at 1929. And the reason you're looking at 1929 is that the tools that central governments have to combat a significant economic downturn are mostly gone.
Surely the worst that will happen in New Zealand is that our debt to GDP ratio climbs into the 50s. And when you consider America's debt to GDP ratio is 123%, Japan's is 254%, UK's is 85%, France's is 98%, and Germany's 59%, moving up in debt to GDP ratio won't mean anything to the average voter if they see value in that extra government spending. Will voters in anoraks with their plane spotting guides and toy train collectibles really be up late at night in 2023 fretting about our debt to GDP ratio?
It's not a New Zealand problem. We are a trading nation. We are dependent on the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Taiwanese buying our stuff. And if the massive, Biden is running $1 trillion deficits. Right. The balance sheet of the Fed is now pushing $8 trillion on a $20 trillion GDP. It's unsustainable. Now, if that stops, then the rationality of the American political psyche at the moment is close to zero. The last time they had a crisis, they went there and they smashed on, I think it was the Smalley Terrace, I can't remember what it was called. The idea that if the rest of the world hits the wall, they're going to stop buying our stuff, and we're not going to be able to borrow to maintain our living standards. And so, the problem will be, it won't be a rise in our debt, it will be a collapse in our GDP.
Final quick round question to you all. When does inflation become political this year, Bernard?
It's already political, but I have a different view on where inflation goes, and I also have a less apocalyptic view on what happens with interest rates and the global economy. Because the one thing we've learned in the last 15 years is that whenever there is a market tantrum or conniption and prices fall 5-10%, then you can be damn sure the central banks will jump in and cut interest rates and start printing money again to stabilize the situation. So this is the thing. There's always a reaction to these things, and with the central banks in charge and governments still happy to use fiscal policy to make the wealthy and people owning businesses stable, then you're not going to see that sort of collapse. The only problem becomes when the voters, enough voters, want to change that particular system. And unfortunately, I think at the moment, they're unlikely to change it in a way that would make a difference, because unfortunately, a lot of these people are unhappy and have missed out on the last 15 to 20 years. They've become captured by those who just want to extend the current situation.
Simon,
Trump supporters.
Simon, when does inflation become political this year?
Yeah, I think it. I hesitate to say it has, but I think it's already clearly one of the big issues that New Zealand is going to be focused on this year. I'm not apocalyptic either, but I know, and I'm not suggesting Bernard is disagreeing, inflation really matters. It does just quite simply mean people have less today to do what they were doing yesterday. I think, don't quote me, but you look around at New Zealand economists, certainly internationally, it seems like it's more than a transitory thing here. There's some baked-in factors going on that mean this is around for a while. If it isn't, the only way it won't be is if Adrien Orr lifts the OCR consistently over the course of this year, and of course
which he's promised to do.
New Zealanders. Well, that's right, and that will hurt New Zealanders in other ways. So, I think these are certainly, when you say they're political or not, they're certainly big issues for New Zealanders, and they're going to be much more focus for them than they were even in 2021.
Damien, when does inflation become political?
I think the 27th of this month, when the next 90 days is out from Stats New Zealand. People keep talking about 4.9%, which is how prices have increased in the last 365 days. What people consistently fail to ignore is that in the last 90 days, up to September, inflation was at 2.2%. That means that it's travelling at an annual rate of nearly 9%. If that trend continues, and we get another 2.2% at the end of this month for the 90 days ended at the end of December, then I think you are going to start to see people panicking. If inflation comes in at like 1.5% for the next 90 days, then we will know it is transitory.
Comrades, we need to wrap the show with a final word. Damien Grant, your rant for 90 seconds, please. Go to the mountaintop, brother.
I want to talk about China. There is a rather solipsistic view we have of China's role in the world. We fret about Hong Kong because we have some colonial links to there. We look at Taiwan because we understand the links. But there is two things we need to understand about China. One, the current regime in China we think will be there forever, and exactly the same way that we thought the Soviets will be there forever. We should not assume that. We have seen massive changes in China happening before Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and now Xi. But the other thing is, if you have a look at China's influence on the world on a wider scale, its Belt and Road Initiative, its activities within China, China is a net positive in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons. And I think we just need to accept the fact that this is China's decade.
Simon, your final word this week.
Yeah, I mean, I've said a lot of it, but inflation really matters. The reality is there's a heap of things going into this. A lot of it is international. Other countries have high inflation rates. I accept this. But actually, if you go just across the ditch, it's 3% as opposed to 4.9% here. I don't think it's transitory. I do think a lot of it is domestic. And I think whilst Grant Robertson may not be solely to blame, certainly isn't, and a lot of other factors have gone into it. Right now, increasing the government spending, that $128 billion I talked about, that 68% increase, actually seems pretty reckless to me. It will hurt a lot of New Zealanders. I think the worry is what it means is, with wage growth being slower and lower than inflation, a lot of New Zealanders get hurt and feel that the basics that they could afford, they just can't anymore. I think that's a worry, and I think the answer is, for Grant Robertson, the government, just to rein it back a bit. I'm not talking cuts. I'm not talking any of that. I'm just talking about actually where they were going to spray it around a bit, pull that back in a bit, and do New Zealanders a favour.
Bernard, your final word this week.
I'd love to know which bits the government shouldn't spray around. And I'll ask.
Well, I could tell you, but I've used my 90 seconds.
Bernard, if you'd like to give Simon some of your 90 seconds.
Absolutely.
Cede your ground.
No, my view is quite different to most others who look at this. I don't think inflation will last for too much longer. I also don't think it's the government causing inflation here. It's actually the housing market and some temporary things overseas and energy prices, neither of which either the government or the Reserve Bank can influence. I think we should be having, once COVID's out of the way, touch wood, we should be having a proper debate about how both sides of politics can come together and achieve what they did in the late 80s, which is reset expectations on inflation, but this time on house prices.
So, Bernard, just on inflation, $100, where do you think inflation's going to go? And whatever number you do, I'll pick higher. You pick a number. I'll go 1%. I'll go 1% higher.
So in the next 2 years, I think we'll.
Oh no! Just give us the next year because I can.
He won't remember.
I won't remember.
Oh, okay. All right. New Zealand, 3%.
3% the next 12 months.
Yep.
$100.
There we go.
I would have put $1,000. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, Bernard has a Substack called the Kaka, THEKAKA.substack.com. Well worth the money.
Thank you, comrades. To my final word this week, the big tech czars have manipulated our collective fear, ego, anger, and insecurities through social media in a way that has led to the largest psychological civil war ever launched against one another. We are but meat bags, secreting hormones addicted to dopamine rewards for fat, sugar, salt, and sex in a cultural landscape of individualism uber alles, where we sing sweet secret lies to ourselves to make sense of a world around us that is frightening and in constant entropy. Meanwhile, the planet burns and every aspect of our existence is monetarized for big data to sell us more stuff we can't afford. We are alienated and anesthetized by consumer culture that keeps us neurotic and disconnected. Our work, our existence, every move we make are all built to suck money to a minority class that sits above us, while under neoliberalism, globalization, financialization, and automation, our existence as individuals has become more disposable. 2022 is a good time to start smoking, drinking, and eating more butterfried bacon because fuck it, this year has the potential to go really bad and you may as well load up on distracting vices. Here's Tom with the weather. That was The Working Group, New Zealand's greatest weekly political podcast that isn't funded by New Zealand On Air. Our thanks to Simon Bridges, Bernard Hickey, Damien Grant. This will be uploaded on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Rova, and YouTube. We will see you 7:30 p.m. next Monday for our International Affairs special. Kia ora and ka pai.
That was New Zealand's greatest weekly political podcast, The Working Group. Not 1 minute of this show was funded by New Zealand On Air. Nope, no creamy public broadcasting money for us. That was The Working Group.
Fantastic.